Nice.
That's nice.
And I cannot walk by anyone without them saying, "Can we pet your puppy? Can we pet your puppy?" Like, yes. And then she wants to follow them home.
Yeah.
So far, so good.
All right, it is 4:59, so I'm gonna let the group in unless there's any other questions or comments before we get started.
Sounds good. Let's do it. Are we all in?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. It is 5 p.m., so I'm going to turn it over to Patty to get started in just a second. This meeting is being recorded, and we also request that folks use raise hands before you speak, just so we can regulate any crosstalk that's going on. And Patty, please.
Thank you very much. Welcome this evening, everyone. I want to once again thank you all for the time that you have been putting into this project. We appreciate it very much. It is 5 o'clock and we are going to get started. I want to start by inviting you to join me in centering our conversation tonight. First of all, I'm going to read a statement, and then I will ask you to join me in a breathing exercise to help bring focus and thoughtfulness to the conversations we have today. So today we convene to listen and learn from each other through reflection and discussion. As we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we elevate the voices and experiences of the communities who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank all those who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustices in Tigard and our broader community, and we build off their efforts to create more equitable and just outcomes for people of all backgrounds and abilities. The purpose of these meetings is to develop our understanding of current public safety structures, practices, and procedures, to identify and eliminate institutional racism within Tigard's public institutions by centering equity and racial justice, to bring forward the concerns and experiences of ourselves and our community, and to bring recommendations to city leadership to improve the lived experiences of all people in Tigard. So with that in mind, I would like to invite you to join me in the breathing exercises. During this particular exercise, you are welcome to turn off your cameras. So please close your eyes or gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your hands in your lap. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and begin to breathe normally. Thank you all for participating and creating space with me. Kim, are you ready to do a roll call?
I am, thank you. So Commander McDonald won't be joining us this evening. Officer Nunn?
Yep.
Shelby Rahala also won't be joining us this evening. Judge O'Brien?
Here.
Elise Butera? Emilio Calderon?
Here.
Liz Newton won't be joining us. John Trin?
Here.
Jimmy Brown?
Here.
Lee Landers? Patty Lothgren?
Here.
Justin won't be joining us. Annie Rauda?
Here.
Valerie Sasaki?
Here.
Sean Stoldryer?
Here.
Nick Charmer?
Here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeff Mott.
Here.
That is roll. Thank you, Patty.
All right. So Kim, do we have any public comment this evening?
We did. We received a public comment, and I sent the written comment out to the group. It was received late this afternoon. We have a policy that we receive public comment up till 4:30. And we did also receive a request to speak. I have sent Mr. Potoff our Zoom information. He might be having some technical difficulties. I haven't heard from him. So it might make sense for us to move into the judge's presentation, and maybe when it makes sense to interrupt, we can go back to the public comment. Oh, sorry, we go forward with the chief's update, and
I
then
was going to say, I had it on my schedule that we were going to have chief's update.
so maybe it makes sense for us to move forward with the chief's update.
Okay, and Commander McDonald is not here. So Chief McAlpine, are you going to be giving us an update this evening?
I am going to try it without my video since I just got power back and my connection is somewhat sketchy. So we'll see how this goes.
Thank you.
The only update that I wanted to pass along was that we did start our community academy last Wednesday. It was well attended. The topics included just an overview of what my expectations are to employees. I got a copy of that letter, went over the strategic plan, our mission, vision, and values. They took a tour, and then they went on to Commander McDonald and Sergeant Duncan talked about our recruitment and hiring process. So that was the first day. And I believe you also received, as requested, a little bit of information on traffic stops that lead to searches. And again, because we participate in the stop data, I think Commander McDonald sent you 1 year's worth of data that showed on searches what those numbers are. And that is all for my update.
Thank you, Chief McAlpine. Are we then going to move on to Judge Oberhofer and O'Brien?
Actually, Mr. Potoff has joined us, so I'm going to admit him.
Okay.
So as Mr. Potoff is joining us, just a kind of, we haven't had a lot of folks come to speak during the public comment period. So just a brief reminder, he will have 5 minutes to deliver his comments. You are under no, you don't need to respond, although you can ask questions if you so choose, or you can say thank you very much for your comment. It is up to the board's discretion.
Okay, so Mr. Potoff, thank you very much for taking time to speak with the public.
Sorry, he's still connecting. He's having some
okay.
issues.
Mr. Potoff, can you hear me?
Mr. Potoff?
Still waiting. Okay, it looks like you're still connecting to audio. We'll give you another couple of minutes here. Thank you for your patience.
Looks like he was able to connect.
All right. Can you hear us now, Mr. Potoff? Still waiting.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for taking time to speak with the Public Safety Advisory Board this evening. Your comments are vital to the board's mission. As Kim said, you have about 5 minutes to present to the board, and then we will have some time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, usually I connect Zoom meetings through my computer, but I'm just hanging on to my phone here as this was a last minute endeavor. And thanks to Kathy Nyland for allowing me to join in. I did send in written comments that will, I think, save some of my precious 5 minutes here. And those will be, Kathy, I'm sure will make those available to you folks. But just to give you a brief summary of what my concerns are, I want to put it in context with some of the information that's come forward to us through the city of Tigard and what I've picked up on the website, and that relates to the number of people in our community, which I think exceeds 30% who are over the age of 65. And so this whole concept of elders in our community, of which I am one at age 73, and my wife at age 71, is a matter of both, I think, great promise for our community and a matter of, I think, we have to be focused on what special responsibilities and concerns are impacting this particular segment of our community. And I will leave my remarks, my written remarks, to go into the specifics that prompted me to reach out to you folks this evening. And just say that there's been so much stress across the nation and indeed the globe that impacts and makes people feel insecure about the most commonplace things in their daily lives. And that certainly is no less a concern and impact to people who are over the age of 65, if we have to set a arbitrary height on that hurdle. And so I would ask that when we think about public safety, we think about some of these more subtle forces that are at play that cause people to feel stress in respect to the security in their homes, the security in their neighborhoods, the security of their bank accounts, et cetera, all of these things that we see. And while I know from some of my political activism on behalf of candidates that they do a lot of polling, and what I've come to observe from some of these polling things as they translate down, especially into local elections, is that many times the people who are now being polled, they almost adopt the positions that they pick up off of the national news or national social media, et cetera. And so they parrot those things back. And so, things like, well, the murder rate in the community is a big concern, and gangs and drug use and homelessness. And while those things are all very real and they are concerns, I think we also have to understand that sometimes people are almost parroting back what they see the pundits putting forward when someone hands them an opportunity to speak. And I think that when we start talking about, especially about elders, that there's some things that are just very subtle. I mean, if there's a person who's walking their dog and they're going to, and the dog is defecating in the yard, do you go out there and say, hey, would you please pick that up? Or do you just sort of shudder inside? And if you shudder inside, what impact does that have on the rest of your day? And other aspects of just our life in our community, I think indicates that there are some things that are going on, concerns that are far more subtle, that have just a drip effect on the well-being of seniors in our community. And I'm just asking that we incorporate into our consideration of public safety some of these effects. And in Oregon, we have, and this is a part of the topic that I made written comment on, the Elder Persons and Disabled Persons Abuse Prevention Act. And I've given cites in my written statement to that. And I would ask that this body take a look at those statutes and reflect upon how does the mandates, the legislative mandates in those statutes translate into how our police officers and our social service people and even our relationship with our neighbors, how does that all, how does it impact that? What is the message that we've adopted through legislation, and are we living up to that? And I'll just leave my remarks at that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Potoff, for coming to speak with us this evening.
Thank you for listening.
Are there any questions at all for Mr. Potoff at this time?
I think Jimmy has a question.
Jimmy.
Hi, Roger. Jimmy Brown here. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for.
Go, Jimmy. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just good to hear your voice.
Well, thank you, and I'm hoping that things are better for you. One, as I was looking at your report, is part of your concern that the department didn't appear to take serious your concerns about the issues with your neighbor?
Absolutely.
And in the sense that there was no officer that was sent to take a report from you, either at the moment or at any later period of time.
That's correct. And if I can, let me expand on my affirmative answer there, just to say that, the idea that the only time that we're going to roll an officer to a scene is if there's a weapon involved, or if there is an explicit threat of, I'm going to blow your head off. If it's that there are number one, there are just intuitive or implied, but nonetheless very real communications in terms of what it means to say to somebody, you're going to pay a price for this. And especially given, volumes, et cetera. Now that's number one. Number two is the fact that if you read in my statement, if you go and you look at Oregon's revised statutes 124, and I won't belabor the point with all of the sites, it's all in that written statement. You will see that the response that I received was totally out of sync with what that statute provides in respect to the Abuse Prevention Act as it applies to elders. And so I'm trying to help the city hold off a lawsuit. Not from me. That's we're gonna find a way to get through all of this, but sooner or later it's going to happen, because if we have public servants in the definitions that I've included in there by statute, but reference, they make it very clear that there is an obligation to report this kind of activity to people who are trained in what elder abuse looks like. I mean, the statute's really, really expansive, and it's very enlightening. And I think we need to train our police officers and our code enforcement people and as to what the reporting responsibilities are. I mean, if we're holding, as the statute does, hold cosmetologists liable or creates a duty on their part to report when they perceive that somebody may be show signs of abuse, and the definitions of abuse are in the statute, and believe me, they include what occurred at my front door the other day.
Thank you
Okay.
for your response. And Sean, please.
Hi, Roger. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to just say thank you for bringing up your comments about the steady drip drip and just the general, I think, concerns people have about safety and the availability of resources to come out and solve some of these problems so that people, one, feel that they're safe, and two, feel that help is around the corner when you need it. One of my coworkers recently retired early, and he's looking at leaving the state. His wife was working in a building, and she works in the city of Portland. He lives in the city of Portland, and essentially there was a burglary in broad daylight, and she called the police, and the Portland police just said, "Well, are you out of the building?" Yes, I'm out of the building. Okay, well then just let your building manager know, and there's nothing more we can do. And they weren't going to come out. And that's really uncomfortable. That's really uncomfortable to feel in a large public building as a consultant for a public agency, and it was off hours or something, and the police department did not have the resources to come out. That was startling for them, and it was one of a few things. They made some big decisions. So, anyways, thank you for sharing that. I seem to just keep hearing stories like this. I could keep telling stories. I'm sure a lot of us can, but for the time, and not to try to take this over, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I appreciate that. And I want you to know that this isn't going to be a one and done thing with me. I don't have an axe to grind here, but I have a community that I value being a part of. And so I want to be part of a solution, not just an echo of the problems that are out here.
Thank you, Mr. Potter.
You're welcome.
Oh, Jimmy, actually, Nick Jarmer just put up his hand. Unless you have a follow up from your earlier questions.
Well, I guess it's really a follow-up, because I certainly appreciate the conversation with the PSAB tonight. And I guess I would just ask Roger if there has been an opportunity to connect with the department about your particular situation, and have you been able to connect with the department through this process, or has there been someone that you could connect to?
Well, I called the department and I asked if I could get a recording, and that's something that I said in my written statement also. And they said, no, the field calls between a citizen and a cell phone call between an officer and a citizen on an event, those aren't recorded. And so, that's okay. So and believe me, I understand that the police have better things to do and more serious matters. But there's something that's just part of this drip, drip, drip thing. And so I haven't talked to Chief McAlpine, and she knows who I am, and she, I think, knows that I have the best interests of this community in mind. But I haven't belabored that. And then when I saw that that we have a public safety advisory board, I said, well, that's probably a good avenue to pursue. And so all of this is really rather recent. And so I said, well, I'm going to start there, because, the chief and I get it. Everybody is stretched to the limit, and all I want to do is I just don't want to have some of these things fall into the silence that a lot of elders feel. I'm not one of those silent elders. But not everybody is like that has the personality that I have that's going to pick it up and say, hey, enough of this stuff. Let's look at why this is happening and where does this lead? How does this end? That's my personality. And so, but not everybody's going to do that. But I thought that the Public Safety Advisory Board would be the preferred venue for this. And I appreciate your time and listening.
Thank you. And Nick, please.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Roger, for speaking to us this evening. I'm a retired law enforcement professional, about 31 years. And what you said just a second ago, when you said, I know the police have more important things to do, the most important thing that police have to do is what you need them to do. So I hope you always remember that. That's what I tried to live by in my time in law enforcement. From a board member perspective, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Ken Ross interactions. I was reading a written statement, and you said that he had brought extra pressure on the property owner to bring compliance, but it came with unintended consequences. So I'm wondering, from your point of view, to tell the board what we might recommend. Is there any change in that, that process?
Well, that's a really, that's a very comprehensive question. And Kathy Nyland knows of my attempt. We're having some real problems here on Ann Street. And they're all neighbor to neighbor problems. And so with respect to nuisance situations here, which is exactly what led to the 911 call. But to answer your question, and this is, and I think this will be telling, because when I was talking to Officer Will when he called, as opposed to coming over, and I told him that the genesis of this thing was a code compliance issue that this person who has basically figured that the city wasn't going to do anything about it. They're too short-staffed and everything else, like every other city in America, to deal with the issues that are part of that complaint. And so, but then when the city council and I had made the presentation and wrote a letter, then he said, oh, okay, well, that's the genesis of that. There were no weapons involved, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, so it sounds like a civil matter. And so while I was waiting after the 911 call, and before Officer Will called me, and because I thought he was going to come over, or whoever was going to come over, I then called Ken Ross, because I have Ken Ross's cell number. It was after 5 o'clock on a Thursday, and they don't work Fridays. But and Ken picked up, and I told him what had happened, and that's where the unintended consequences come, because when Ken Ross, as the code enforcement person, ratchets up the enforcement which is exactly what has to happen. That's part of the problem, is that there has not been a uniform, serious enforcement of a lot of these things. And another big part of the problem is it is citizen driven. It's complaint driven. And that puts neighbor on neighbor. And so when the clock strikes 5 on Thursday, and Ken's off for the weekend, and everybody's now it's just neighbor to neighbor. And the problem, and so, and nothing happens on these complaints because they'll set a 20-day time frame on the complaint. In other words, they'll take the complaint, they send a letter to the person, and they say, okay, you got 20 days to clear this stuff up. But they don't come back. The city doesn't come over to check and see if anything has been resolved. It's put back on the complaining party that if there's still conditions that are non-compliant, that citizen has to then say, well, here's my photos. Here's the evidence I have. And when you're taking photos of somebody else's property, even though it is allowed under the law in Oregon to stand on a public right-of-way and take a picture of a yard or whatever, believe me, that becomes an irritant to the persons whose property is being photographed. And it becomes a neighbor to neighbor, unnecessary fuel for trouble. And we know what happens in America. We know how well armed Americans are. And we know that sooner or later, it doesn't go well. And unintended consequences come from this neighbor on neighbor complaint driven nuisance thing. You could drive down Ann Street in a City of Tigard truck, and you could see, as well as the person who's living here 24/7, that something's out of whack. But until his neighbor steps up and calls and complains, nothing happens.
Thank you, Mr. Potoff, very much for your time this evening and for bringing this to the board. We will keep it in mind in our future work. But we are going to now move on with our meeting. I think, Patty, our next agenda item.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Potoff, for joining us this evening.
Good evening.
I would like to invite Judge Oberhofer and Judge O'Brien to continue our conversation in terms of the judicial process and other judicial topics on our agenda this evening. Welcome.
Hi, good evening. Judge O'Brien, are you with us? Okay.
I am. I just had to find the unmute button for the umpteenth time.
Perfect.
We have the usual dreaded PowerPoint show that you'll recall from last time. I'm going to bring that up on the screen. As before, we want to invite people to bring in their questions at any time. I can't see the hands raised when I'm looking at the PowerPoint show, so I'll count on Kim or Patty to do that and take care of the questions and bring them to our attention. I just want to start with an overview of the agenda and where we are this week. We're pretty much in the middle of the program. We got through the first three agenda topics last time. Emily will be talking about Tigard Municipal Court, and as before, we're on a first name basis here. We're not sure how far we'll be able to get today. We hope we might be able to get into the sanctions portion, but we realize we have a little just over an hour on the agenda, and we'll try to stick with that while inviting questions, as I said. And also we have people with a lot of legal experience here, including our colleagues Shelby and Valerie, of course, but also Jimmy had a career in the criminal justice system, and we have Nick, as we just found out. I'd forgotten that he had been an officer for so long, and others who have experience that they're more than welcome to share with us. So our goal here is just to go over the operations and policies of the Tigard Municipal Court and to put what we do in the context of Oregon's criminal justice system and some of the issues that come up or have come up in recent years involving court operations. And we hope that that will provide this group with a foundation for any recommendations that you might choose to make later on in the process. So, Emily?
Thank you. I think we are picking up with the next slide where we are going to talk about our court specifically. So Tigard Municipal Court used to handle criminal cases. At this point, just violations and a few civil matters here and there. That is a screenshot of our website page. Oh, I wanted to ask if anybody had any questions before we got started. Sorry about that. Okay, next slide, please.
Emily, I would like to just mention that we you may recall, we did a criminal court study back in 2008. We were looking seriously at reestablishing a criminal court, a misdemeanor court. But that was the year when the city, because of the general failure of the economy with the Great Recession, wisely decided not to take on any new services. So that did not happen.
We have a question from Sean.
Question. Okay, so is this why I've never heard of the city having a prosecutor? And it seems like, so there's a county, and I'm definitely not from the legal world. We have a county prosecutor, and then the criminal cases go to Washington County. Is that correct?
Yes, criminal cases go to the Washington County Circuit Court, which is in Hillsborough. We handle violations. If a defendant on their traffic ticket violation, which is predominantly what we hear, hires a defense attorney, then the city of Tigard brings in a prosecutor whose name is Larry Blake, and he assists the police department in the prosecution only if there's a defense attorney involved or if good cause is shown for him to represent the city for another reason. I haven't seen any motions for good cause so far, but I have seen Mr. Blake appear when defendants are represented. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
And I just want to add,
Absolutely.
Sean, that municipal courts have jurisdiction over misdemeanors, and quite a few of them, like Beaverton, hear misdemeanors, but our council has, at least for now, elected not to have a misdemeanor court.
Okay, makes
I
sense.
wouldn't be surprised if it happened in the future, though.
Makes sense. Sounds efficient today. All right, thank you.
And we have a
Yes,
question.
absolutely.
Sorry, we have a question from Jimmy.
Thanks, folks. Before obviously we get into your piece, I'm sitting here and I'm looking back at Roger's situation that he described, and notwithstanding, wanting to have some type of police engagement or involvement, the statute that he references, clearly shows that there is a place for the courts to look at types of situations where derogatory and or threatening terms are used in the presence of an elder person. So as I look at that, and I'm thinking about what Roger's kind of looking at, is the municipal court the site or the venue for these types of neighborhood nuisance types of complaints, citizen to citizen, neighbor to neighbor types of complaints? Is this the place? Should they move toward a court engagement situation? Is this the court of record that would come into play? Or is this something that's going to end up at the court in Hillsborough?
We are definitely not a court of record, which we are not recorded, but that's a simplistic answer. Judge O'Brien, have you seen a complaint like this cited in? I've only seen matters cited in by compliance officers. I haven't seen a city to city immuni court.
No, I
or a
haven't
citizen
either.
to citizen immuni court.
Yeah, we've all heard about neighborhood mediation programs, and that might be one way to start that. I don't think we have any equivalent to that right now, where a mediator could sit down and try to resolve conflicts within a neighborhood without resort to any formal legal action. But really, really, in order for us to deal with a situation, we have to have a formal complaint of some kind. And of course, that it couldn't be a criminal complaint. I just don't know how under the city code that kind of neighbor-to-neighbor conflict would rise to the level of coming into municipal court. But I certainly agree that's a serious issue. And mediation programs are functional in larger cities. I know that in Oregon.
And I think it would depend on the relief sought. All we could really do is say, you have to clean up your yard. Some questions that popped into my head when I was listening to Mr. Potoff was, does he need a restraining order or a stalking order or something like that? And that's all handled in circuit court. But without the background of the information, I don't know what we could do in our court to help him.
Yeah, and of course, judges, we couldn't initiate anything as a court, but if there was any way for us to be handling a case where we had jurisdiction involving disputes between neighbors, if there were something adopted in the municipal code to allow that process, we could provide mediation. But to my knowledge, there's nothing like that currently. Jimmy, does that answer your question?
Well, it does. Judge, it kind of leads to, the thinking cap happening again. And I think Roger makes a really good point that we're living in some times that where the simple situations may lead to unintended consequences, which may ultimately become very threatening to individuals in a particular community. And so, it leads me to say, well, gosh, do we actually have a neighborhood mediation process inside of our community? If we don't, why not? We obviously are growing. As we all know that as people, as communities grow, the opportunities for engagement that isn't of the best type can increase, and thus, put us into conflict. It's always good to have trained conflict resolvers or mediation specialists that are available to go out and deal with, neighbor-to-neighbor conflicts. I know we have a community services function inside of the department, I believe, if that's correct, Chief, and perhaps maybe those are folks that are somewhat tasked with doing some type of neighbor-to-neighbor intervention and mediation activities. But again, I think the chief would have to let us know about that.
Jimmy, that's a great point. And we have time at the end of this meeting to talk about future topics and maybe some sort of conflict resolution or mediation. And further will be a good topic for future, because we do have some time remaining.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the chief has a response.
Yeah, the community service officers, that isn't their role. In fact, they're unarmed other than a taser. Theirs is to do parking complaints, impounds, and cold calls like graffiti and things of that nature, and to help our motor officers who are dealing with traffic accidents, and they'll set up flares and help out on that. So they aren't there to deal with community complaints.
Thanks, Chief. And Sean.
I took Roger's frustration as a genuine concern about him and his wife's physical safety right now. And I would agree with what Judge Oberdorfer mentioned about what's the possible next step, a restraining order. And then I think his frustration is just someone that's been in the community for a while and just kind of, in a way, indicting the values and, the directions. I mean, he had a lot of political comments in there. I definitely take his point about just tone and temperament of just folks in the community, what's setting people off. It's the root causes of, what's happening. And they're very difficult things to talk about right now.
Thank you, Sean. And Chief, is your hand still up or did you have another comment?
No, I thought I lowered it. I'll try again.
Thanks. And Patty, please.
I just want to build on a bit on what Kim just said, and I'm just wondering if this might be something that we consider in terms of that, and I can't remember what we ended up calling the ombudsman person that we talked about several meetings ago, but this seems to me like it might be right up their alley, which we haven't really defined yet. So yeah, Kim, I agree. This is a topic for future.
Thank you, Patty. And judges, please.
May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I was appointed by City Council. There was a series of interviews that got me here. I was a pro tem judge for Michael O'Brien when he was presiding, along with a man named Bruce Leibowitz. Both Judge Leibowitz and Judge O'Brien are my pro tems now. And pro tem simply means a part-time judge that fills in when the presiding judge is out of town. One of the advantages, or some of the advantages of having a municipal court, is that it is more convenient for defendants. I think it is less intimidating to walk into City Hall than to walk into Washington County Circuit Court with the metal detectors and all of that kinds of things. Police officers are our primary witnesses in municipal court, and they are right across the hall from where we sit in town hall, which is certainly convenient for them. And the hope is that we are more familiar with our community than circuit court judges, which I think and I hope plays into some of the stuff that we have been talking about today. I understand, or I've gleaned, that some of you on this meeting are familiar with Mr. Potoff, and that's the kind of thing that I should be familiar with. Who are the folks that are involved in the community? What are the neighborhoods like? What is traffic like through that area, and that kind of stuff. The next slide.
I want to add one thing, Emily, if I can interrupt.
Please.
When Judge Leibowitz and I were hired back in 1989, we've both been here for quite a while. I started presiding in 1992, but at that time, all we had to do to get hired was submit written answers to questions. There was no interview even. So it was rather an informal process, and Emily went through quite a different experience in order to be hired by the council eventually. Sorry to interrupt, Emily.
Not at all. Thank you. With all of that institutional knowledge, I need you to interrupt me a lot. The training of judges and attorneys is mostly through the Oregon State Bar. We have continuing legal education requirements, there's general education credits, ethics credits. There's all different kinds of categories. The one that I think is that Judge O'Brien and I think is most applicable to what we're talking about here is the access to justice credit. And the language that the bar uses is identifying and eliminating barriers to equitable access to counsel, legal assistance, and resources faced by underserved and marginalized groups, and improving the delivery of legal services to the public. So here in the municipal court, what that looks like is much more than simply getting that credit. We take it very seriously. So we try to, some things that I try to do to help myself with access to justice are things like reading, getting as much reading material as I can, both through things like the Oregon State Bar and Oregon Live, talking about the crisis in the defense attorneys and prosecutors right now are facing, to also reading novels written by people of color or folks that are not like myself. It also, Tigard has begun to provide DEI education for all of the employees. Court staff is, we get to be at the forefront of that. So there's some extra DEI training coming our way. As I understand it, in the next month or so, the city has gotten a certain number of licenses. And because of the work that we do with the court, we get to have access to that before the larger staff. And so I really welcome more questions about that. I think that that's probably something this group is interested in. At this point, we have 3 bilingual clerks, Spanish, English, bilingual clerks. So we have somebody, we hope to have somebody in the office, and we usually do have somebody in the office at all times that speaks Spanish. And we have somebody able to do interpreting at all times in the courtroom as well. I do not speak any languages other than English. So that's kind of a big slide. Are there any questions about that before I ask for the next one?
I'd like to add one more thing, Emily, and that is under training of judges and attorneys, both Emily and I are members of the Oregon Municipal Judges Association, which has been around since 1984. And I'm pleased to announce that Emily was just elected to the board of directors. And I've been on the board for a few years. I left the presidency of the organization a couple weeks ago, but I'm a member still as the past president. So Tigard is very overrepresented proportionately on this with what I think there are currently 11 members on the board, Emily, 2 of whom are from
I believe there's 11, yeah.
Yeah, right. And they have 2 annual conferences that provide 3 days each of, well, 2.5 days each of training.
There are no hands.
Okay, may I have the next slide, please? So the most common thing that I see in the courtroom, most common violation is folks that are going between 11 and 20 miles an hour over the speed limit on 99. That is by that's a Class C traffic violation, and by a large margin, the most common citation. I think second is the failure to obey a traffic control device, which translates to running a stop sign or mostly running a red or yellow light. Those are also captured by photo radar, but it is my understanding have been consistently the most common citation throughout the existence of Tigard Municipal Court. We also see a lot of folks come in who have been picked up or have been cited after the department gets a grant. And I think probably Chief McAlpine can speak a little bit more about this, but my understanding of the process is that the department gets a grant from someone like ODOT to look for folks using mobile electronic devices, which we usually call cell phones. So there'll be a particular officer or officers that are looking for that particular violation because it's been deemed to be a necessity. So then we will end up seeing a bunch of cell phone tickets all at once, or a bunch of seatbelt tickets all at once. And the cell phones, I'm glad to see that the numbers are going down on that. I think the message is getting out that those are as serious as drunk driving as far as accidents go, and that they could land in jail if you get enough of them. The 2020 photo implementation was certainly a big deal and a big change to the court. Having been a pro tem before that and presiding after photo enforcement, the sheer number of cases that are coming through has been astounding. I think that citizens and community members and folks passing through have vastly different opinions on whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. The things that I like to mention to folks who get them and aren't feeling so great about getting ticketed by a machine is that it's not a machine. There's a human being, a police officer, who watches the evidence and determines whether or not they think a violation has occurred. I think that makes people feel a lot better in and of itself. And then we can talk about how that is perhaps the flow of traffic going down 99. Everybody was going that fast. If that's the case, chances are everybody got a ticket. It wasn't subjective. You didn't get picked out because you have Washington plates or because you have a nice car or a bad car or a motorcycle or whatever it is that folks feel targeted about. I don't bring up race, ethnicity, age, that kind of thing very much when I'm talking about the subjectivity of it. And there are still photographs, so I kind of steer away from that. And of course, the fact that there's video makes it a lot, there's something tangible that everybody can look at. I find that's less helpful for speeding, but very, very helpful when we talk about running a red light. And then the next slide shows huge growth and what we're seeing. And Judge O'Brien, anything to fill in there?
Well, I just want to add that, as you can see from these numbers, Emily walked into a very different, well, the court was in transition when I went into semi-retirement and she took over. She walked into a very different court than we were in 2019. In terms of the workload for the judge, for example, I was working maybe 50 hours a month. And I know for a fact that there have been weeks that Emily has worked that much. And it's been creating a lot of administrative duties as well, having that volume of cases. And my administrative role was fairly minimal because we had a staff of, I think it was 3.5 full-time equivalent. We had a court manager and we had 3 court clerks at the time. And it's just we moved to a different space with the addition of photo enforcement. And all of it was very carefully planned, I think, but what we didn't plan for was the pandemic. So with that, Emily, back to you.
Yes, it's a very different court now. You did set us up well. We had some idea of what was coming and how we were going to handle it, but the pandemic and we do not have a court administrator anymore. And Nadine Robinson, who I'm sure a lot of you know and love, retired as well. So we don't have her institutional knowledge. We do have a wonderful team of smart folks. Some have been with us for 5 years. Some came during the pandemic. But yeah, it's different now. And the next slide kind of goes into what Judge O'Brien was talking about with the double whammy. I guess you can kind of see it there, the backlog of cases and staffing shortages that resulted in about 150 cases being dismissed for speedy trial concerns. There was another one that got dismissed the other day. It had been 597 days since the defendant was cited. We tried to have cases resolved within 90 days. So we're getting much, much closer to that. We expect to be caught up on trials in June and hope to have our backlog of cases caught up by the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st. So digging our way out of the pandemic backlog slowly but surely, with fingers crossed that we don't get another wave shutting us down and all of the other things that come along with that. And then I'm going to pass it back to you, Judge O'Brien, to talk about the next slide, which is peer court. I've never had the opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to mention on the photo enforcement that as we knew going into it, for the police department, the process is relatively simple. They screen the videos, see if there's probable cause to believe a violation has occurred, and the citation is sent out to the address of the registered owner. We have to treat that citation like we would any other one and the concentration of work on the court is much greater than it is on PD. Not to minimize how much effort the program is required by them, but the administrative burden on the court is, I would argue, much greater. We knew that going in, of course. Anyway, on to Peer Court. Peer Court was in operation for quite a while. It's no longer operating, hasn't for a few years. And I think that's partly because it's a pretty staff-intensive process. Basically, it's unlike juvenile court because the teen defendant, and these are teenagers 14 and over, if I remember correctly, had to admit the violation in advance. The court is basically a sentencing court at Peer Court. And we've had either a judge, I presided over some Peer Court sessions, or a local attorney presiding. And then we had, interestingly, a teen prosecutor and defense counsel, and they did a really good job. A lot of them were very effective and in what they were doing. They had a little bit of training in advance. And then the function of the jury, and some of the jurors were teenagers who had themselves been through Peer Court before as a defendant. They can recommend the sentence. And the sentence could not include detention because these are not crimes. These are treated as violations by the court. They're even if they started as a theft offense, they were reduced to a violation. So the typical sentence was community service, a letter of apology, restitution was possible, but I don't recall Peer Court ever ordering restitution. And I have to say that I sat in on a few of the deliberations, but didn't participate. And the jurors were very creative about some of the sanctions that they came up with. And probably the result was a little bit more of a burdensome sentence than they might have received in a juvenile court if they'd gone to juvenile court at all, because these were pretty low-level violations. So are there any questions about Peer Court? I know we talked about this a little bit before. Sean?
Sean.
Could you give examples of the types of violations or a range of the violations?
Absolutely. By far the most common violation I saw was theft 2 and theft 3 shoplifting cases from Washington Square. And that was true of Peer Court and also what I'll talk about in a minute, which is the youth court. A lot of security officers who took kids into custody and brought in the Tigard police to have them charged with theft in the second degree. They were typically released to their parents. The case would have been screened by Washington County, by the Washington County Juvenile Department. And if they deemed it appropriate for a Peer Court treatment, the case would be waived back to Tigard Municipal Court at Tigard Peer Court for hearing on sentencing, assuming that the juvenile was intending to not challenge the citation.
Okay. Thank you.
We had a few traffic crimes too that we saw in youth court, but generally, because of the presence of the square, the overwhelming majority were theft 2, theft 3, basically shoplifting cases.
Thank you. And Patty.
Yes, I was just wondering if there are any plans or a timeline for the potential of bringing back the Peer Court.
Emily, you might know better than me, but I'm not aware of any.
We have put any big changes off until at least the beginning of next fiscal year, at least until I get us out of this hole that we are in, figure out what we need to do with our staffing levels. And then I think Peer Court's on the table, youth court is on the table, developing an in-person traffic school program in Tigard rather than referring it out is on the table. And I think that those are my asks for now. And then my long-term, what I'm thinking long-term is whether or not we want to become a court of record and whether or not we want to begin taking misdemeanors.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Chief, did you have something to add?
Yeah, there's absolutely no conversation about bringing it back. As they alluded to, it's pretty staff intensive, and we had to cut it when we were being reduced a couple of years ago when I first got here, when we had to reduce FTEs. The council did put it in our packet, but then the peer court, who's a half-time person, because of it wasn't very stable, she went on to get another job and we just couldn't absorb it within the department. Also, the juvenile court said that they were going to create something similar. And so we were waiting to see if that was going to come to fruition as opposed to hosting our own. We also looked at Beaverton's to see if we could just jump in with them. And that was a possibility, but again, we didn't have anybody within the department that could absorb all of the workload that it requires.
Thank you, Chief. And Sean. Oh.
Sorry, I forgot to hit the lower hand button.
Emilio, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I was never part of peer court, but I had a lot of friends who were on TIAC, and they were, and all I ever heard about peer court is how great of a system it was. I know Judge O'Brien mentioned that very briefly, and everyone who participated in it loved it. And I mean, I understand that had to go away, but if it could be brought back, I know the youth would love that.
Thanks, Emilio. There's no other questions.
I would agree that it was a very effective program.
Tell us about youth court, Judge O'Brien.
Oh yes, here we are. Next slide. There we go. The youth court was just a little bit different than peer court because it didn't require an admission in advance by the juvenile, but we had relatively few trials. As I said earlier, the large majority of the cases came out of Washington Square, and they involved theft. There were a few graffiti cases, some minors in possession cases, things like that, but overwhelmingly theft cases from Washington Square. Again, these were cases that were weighed by the juvenile department as not serious enough for more formal handling in the juvenile court in Hillsborough. But people still had the right to a bench trial and an attorney, not court appointed because there was no possibility of any detention. But the sanctions were typically community service, letter of apology to the victim, probation. Again, like peer court, it was discontinued because it was very staff intensive.
Then the next slide gets us to adjudication. Do you want me to take this, or are you ready to keep talking?
No, I just wanted to note that we had something like 700 cases go through the youth court over a few years, and it's a very busy court, so it was indeed staff intensive. Emily, if you want to go ahead, we can, or
Sure.
do you want me to take on adjudication?
You go, I'll fill in.
Okay. Just wanted to go back to traffic stops. We started out our presentation with a slide basically describing what a traffic stop is in Oregon, under Oregon law by definition. And reasonable suspicion, there are several grounds for a traffic stop. Reasonable suspicion is one, and that's basically, and I'm quoting, a belief that's reasonable under the totality of the circumstances. And one thing law students notice very quickly is the kind of circularity in reasoning and definition. In other words, a reasonable suspicion is a suspicion that's reasonable. Okay, that's helpful. Well, it provides a little more than that. But anyway, you do see a lot of that in statutory interpretation. Probable cause stops are far more common. They're based on either a violation of the vehicle code or some other offense that the officer observes, or related to some investigation that was initiated prior to the contact. Challenges to traffic stops are rare. Emily and I were talking about this earlier. In violations proceedings quite rare. You'd think that where attorneys were involved, the first thing they would look at would be, well, was there probable cause for the stop? but that's more of an issue in criminal cases where the stakes are much higher. They can, that issue can be raised by motion, a pretrial motion. And again, in criminal cases, especially DUI cases, it's a little bit more common. Warrantless searches, they're pretty rare in Tigard as well. The chief already mentioned that earlier today, vehicle searches. And there's a new case in this area that will probably make them even more rare. State v. McCarthy. I just attended a program that talked mainly about that. And Emily, do you want to plunge into that one? I think you're more familiar with the case than I am, or it's very important.
Well, I haven't read it in 10 days or so, but it is a very important case, and it to some degree does away with what was referred to as the DUI exception in the law. But the long and short of my read of it is without consent, the officers can't search the vehicle without a warrant. The exigent circumstances still exist, but they're going to be pretty rare because it's pretty fast to get a warrant. And I'm kind of dancing around it a little bit because if it does come in front of me, I don't want a YouTube video coming back and saying, well, you said this. So I don't want to nail myself down to anything, but without hearing any argument, which I am open to, that was my read of it.
And it did focus on the transformation of technology that made it so much easier to obtain a warrant, and therefore a little bit less exigent to conduct a warrantless search.
And so in Judge O'Brien and I don't sign search warrants. There are judges from, I know Beaverton has an on-call judge ready to sign warrants 24 hours a day. And there are, I believe, at least 2, if not 3, Washington County Circuit Court judges on call 24 hours a day to take warrants and sign off on those, which the court took into consideration in their decision on McCarthy.
And the next slide is after the traffic stop. Just we're all pretty familiar with this process, I think, but I just want to go over it quickly.
Before we start traffic stops.
Oh, we haven't. I'm sorry, Nick had a question.
Yeah, Nick.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Your Honors. My question's about the probable cause aspect, and it's probably, if I'm not a lawyer or a judge, like you guys are judges, but in criminal offenses, probable cause has a certain amount of, there's a time frame where you had to prove probable cause, and a judge would come in on the weekends to approve or deny probable cause arrest. When you're detaining someone in municipal court, does probable cause have any time frame, 1? And 2, are there restrictions other than what's listed on the slide for probable cause? Thank you.
Emily, do you want to take that one?
I am not familiar with the way that you describe probable cause for criminal matters. My understanding is the way we do it here in Oregon is that folks cannot be detained for longer than a specific period of time without being arraigned, and they can't be kept in custody for a specific period of time without having their case heard and things like that. But I don't think that I'm not familiar with a deadline on probable cause with regard to arrest. There may be something there with grand juries or something that I'm not familiar with, having not done that kind of work. With regard to traffic stops and the kind of work that I am very familiar with, the a police officer either has to witness the violation or conduct an investigation that leads them to their probable cause for issuing the violation. And once that is issued, I don't look into it again unless somebody raises it. So, for example, if somebody comes in and says, the police officer, there's nothing marked, the police officer didn't measure my speed in any way, shape, or form. They didn't pace me, they didn't radar me, they didn't use their laser, there was nothing there. Then I would have a fact-finding hearing into whether or not there was probable cause for the police officer to stop the car. That has, or the vehicle. That hasn't happened, but that's an example that I was able to come up with quickly on when probable cause comes up for us.
Okay.
Judge O'Brien, do you know anything about a hold time for probable cause hearings here in Oregon?
No, I'm not. I'm not aware of any requirement that a judge authorize or find probable cause in order to arrest or detain somebody. That kind of, impromptu hearing that you might have in a warrant situation. So,
No,
Nick, what state are you talking about? Just out of curiosity, is this Oregon?
yeah, no, yes, thank you. You guys answered it perfect. No, I was talking about Oregon, and you're right, Judge Oberdorfer, about the, arraignment and the, 48 hours excluding weekends, the type of thing. And you're spot on. So I appreciate that. I just didn't know if that, when I looked at probable cause, I went a little bit different. I just wanted to make sure. And then you answered that also, that if there was a probable cause, and then the person challenged that and saying that, the officer did not see me run this red light, then there's a process in place. So I was happy to hear that. So you answered it perfectly. I appreciate that.
Oh, good.
Okay, let's see. We're talking about options for defendants and not guilty case. Of course, as we discussed already, you don't have a right to a jury trial in violation proceedings. And in that case, the matter is set for a bench trial, subject to speedy trial limitations that are not entirely clear with violations. If I remember right, Emily, that's with the COVID delays that are going on now, you already referred to that. There are some real issues involving speedy trial and violations matters. No contest plea, just a real quick background on that. Some years ago, you could plead guilty or no contest in violations proceedings. The legislature determined that that's a little bit confusing because judges spend all their time explaining what the difference is. And now we still have to explain what the difference is because people ask what they are. And I'm not sure it really resolved much, but the important thing people need to be reminded is that a no contest plea results in a guilty finding by the court. So in that situation, it's treated like a traditional guilty plea, fines imposed with payment agreement readily available on request. If a case goes to trial, of course, and the defendant prevails, the case is closed, the matter is discharged, no further obligation to the court. If there's a guilty finding at trial, fine can also be imposed, and there is no penalty for entering the not guilty plea, going to trial, and losing. So next slide, please, unless there are questions.
And then what I would briefly add is one thing that I find myself explaining to defendants on a fairly regular basis is that not guilty doesn't mean that a defendant is saying that they are innocent. Yeah. It means that they want to have a trial, and that could be for any reason at all, simply because they're interested in having a trial and seeing what happens, because they want to meet the officer, because they think they can win. We don't go into any of that. We're happy to take their not guilty plea, and we do not punish them for exercising their right to trial.
Okay, next trial on first appearance and arraignment. There was some discussion a few weeks ago about cash bail. We're not a criminal court. There is a 10% rule regarding bail in criminal proceedings, but that's not required in municipal court. Emily, do you want to refine on that a little bit? Or maybe there's nothing.
Oh, I guess in some courts, they say that you have to post the presumptive fine before you can have your trial or before you can do something, talk to the judge, whatever it is that their policy is. We don't require any of that.
At one point, right.
Cash
At one
bail
point
is
long ago, we
certainly a
did.
big issue.
Yeah.
And Valerie, please.
So I did want to talk a little bit about this, if you don't mind, because one of the things that you know, I'm concerned about when we talk about, even if it's not cash bail, right? There's still fines and penalties that this court imposes upon people for motor vehicle violations and for other sorts of things that we've talked about. You know, and the payment or non-payment of those can have a material impact on someone's ability to drive themselves to work and to therefore earn a living. And so I'm curious about, you know, whether the court is considered alternatives to, you know, imposing cash penalties or, you know, working with defendants in those situations, because, you know, you can certainly imagine the situation where you would have someone who didn't have the couple $100s or whatever the penalty that they've incurred is, and how is that situation addressed to avoid a disparate impact on a population that's already living paycheck to paycheck.
Valerie, you have addressed exactly the issue that our next section will deal with, the sanctions on conviction. I appreciate that. And there are a lot of ways to deal with that. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
Sure, no, and I apologize.
Yeah, and there's a lot that courts try to do to accommodate that and avoid pushing people into a deeper hole. But that is a very serious subject, and we promise to spend a lot of time on it.
And I will just say real quickly to put you at ease, hopefully for the time being, Valerie, we have not suspended anybody's license out of our court since before COVID. And we have not sent, I don't think we've sent anybody to collections either. So we'll get into all of that stuff later on, but we're trying to keep people legal and not in the deep hole for the time being.
And it should be mentioned up front that nobody can have their license suspended anymore in Oregon for non-payment of a fine, nor can you be sent to jail for non-payment of a fine. Well, we'll get into that. There is case law on that and some elaborations on that, but we'll get back to that, I promise. Not so sure about this week, but probably not this week, but we will. Okay. I think we covered some of this already. Retained defense attorneys are not common in violation proceedings, partly because it can be expensive and also because the burden of proof is relatively low. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Emily already mentioned that prosecutors don't participate unless the attorney represents a defendant. And if there's a no contest plea at trial, it's treated as if somebody pleaded no contest at arraignment, no sanction for delayed entry of that plea. Next slide, please. Okay, traffic safety program. This has kind of an interesting history, and I think, Valerie, this goes a little bit into your concerns. We've had a diversion program for many years. It was always available since I started as presiding judge for juveniles and also for 55 and over. We had a 55 alive class that people could take. It was sometimes available in an egregious situation where we thought it might be beneficial to a defendant. They would get a break on the fine if they took the class. But a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I would guess, Emily, I went to the city council and proposed that we expand it to include everybody. And now maybe you want to describe to us, the council did adopt a resolution to that effect. And Emily, I think these are pretty much the same conditions that we've had for a while. Do you want to go into that?
Sure. So if folks have, they don't have a commercial driver's license, they don't have, they haven't done a class for dismissal in the last 5 years, they haven't had a conviction for moving violation or crime in the last 5 years, and I have added that they need to come and see me for approval if they have any other pending violations or crimes in our court or any other court. If they meet those criteria, then they probably won't even come and see me. They'll probably just stop with the clerk who will sign them up for traffic school. We are currently referring most defendants to a class, an online class with the National Traffic Safety Institute. It's NTSI. The class costs $29.95, typically takes people about 3 hours to complete altogether. They can stop and start when they want to. There is also a presumptive fee to the court, and if they get the court fee and the class completed within 120 days, we dismiss their citation. The fee to the court depends on the level of violation that they were cited for and pled no contest to. But that one is really more of a grab bag as far as an ability to pay finding is concerned. For violation on fines, the state has set a minimum. For our traffic school program, the city has not set a minimum. So while the clerks don't have any wiggle room on what they give people, I have a wide latitude on the court fee. And sometimes that ends up being zero. Sometimes the presumptive fee for a Class C violation, our most common, is $115, and it's $200 for Class B, which is the running a red light. So that can go down real drastically for folks that that are having financial burdens, and I don't press them too hard on what their financial burden is. If somebody is asking me, you know, and I think I said last time, I don't go through the whole rigmarole that folks need to go through to get a court-appointed attorney. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but that's pretty much our program.
I just want to add that Emily mentioned the CDL, commercial driver's license. By federal and as I recall, also state statute, they're simply not eligible to take any kind of traffic diversion program. And that's something that is absolutely clear. These programs are common in Oregon courts, fairly common, but they're not regulated by statute, so they kind of are across the board in what the requirements are.
Yes.
Next slide, please. Trials. You're all pretty much familiar with this process. The burden of proof is relatively low. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It means more likely true than not, and a lot of judges will use a football analogy that the prosecution has to, or the officer has to get the case to the 50-yard line and then push it another inch. But that's a fairly low burden, and makes, and oftentimes people most of the time people are unrepresented, and officers, of course, are trained witnesses, so they go into the process with a bit of an advantage, and that you know, makes it difficult for an unrepresented defendant at trial. The trial procedure is pretty familiar. Opening statements and closing arguments are not common in typical violation trials, but otherwise it'd be pretty familiar. It seems informal, but we do try to follow a fairly formal process in terms of how the evidence is presented. And there are some differences of opinion on some judges about whether you admit hearsay evidence if there's an unrepresented defendant, or whether the judge has some duty to act as, in effect, kind of defense counsel to protect the process. So we've had some interesting discussions about that at our judges conference, and I don't think I need to get into those details right now, but The trials are very brief, typically under, I would say, under 10 or 15 minutes. And we've had some very long ones, on the other hand, that have gone on all day. So those you might expect involve attorneys. Next slide, unless Emily, you want to add anything?
We follow the criminal rules of procedure rather than the civil rules of procedure. So traffic violations are quasi-criminal matters. That's probably only interesting to 5 people.
It might be interesting to Valerie. She raised her hand.
She was one of the 5 people I was thinking of.
Well, and you may be talking about it in this slide, so I may be jumping the gun again, but I'm just wondering, because it seems like you're dealing with a lot of pro se defendants here, or pro se individuals that, you know, I know in other venues that deal with a lot of pro se venues, they don't adhere to the formal rules of evidence either. So, you know, if you're sticking to the rules of civil procedure, I would expect that there's some evidentiary standards, but I'm probably jumping the gun again. Sorry.
Well, we apply evidentiary standards strictly. At least I try to. Emily, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the rules of evidence apply without question.
Yeah.
So even with respect to hearsay, because and maybe I misunderstood what you were saying when you were saying that you do allow people to testify as to, you know, what to hearsay evidence that would be hearsay, and maybe I misinterpreted the comment on the prior slide.
Yeah, well,
There is a lot of discussion and debate about whether or not to allow hearsay evidence in. I do not give much weight to somebody saying, my brother said he X and Y, unless the brother is there to testify. But I won't make a hearsay objection sua sponte from the bench. I'll try to gently say, well, without your brother here,
Sure.
I can't really take that into account.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a, particularly because you have so many pro ses, there's a balancing act that you have to do as a trier of fact, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Where this gets difficult, Valerie, is when you have an accident and you have the officer show up who investigated the accident but who didn't see it, and the witness who may have been subpoenaed does not appear to describe the kind of driving that led to the accident, which is what would convict the defendant of the violation that's charged. And then, you know, the witness, there's no witness, and the officer starts testifying from his or her report about what the witness said. What role does the judge have to interview and say, well, I can't hear that because that's hearsay testimony. And without it, of course, the officer has a hard time proving the case,
Right.
because you can't show any evidence of the driving other than the physical evidence from the crash. That's where it starts to get tricky for me. And I tend, if that's the only basis, I tend not to allow it. Sometimes in a rear end collision, you can see skid marks, and you know, there's tangible evidence beyond the statement of the witness that you can go on.
Sure, and there are generally exceptions to the hearsay rules anyhow.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So, okay, well, I'll stop boring everybody else on the call, but I caught my ear and I thought it was interesting.
No, that's a good question.
It also comes up very, very frequently in photo radar matters where there's a certificate of non-liability. So a business owns the vehicle, they get the ticket, they say, I wasn't driving, Michael O'Brien was driving. And then Michael O'Brien shows up for trial and just sits there, and the only evidence that he was the driver is an officer saying, I received a certificate of non-liability that said it was Michael O'Brien. That's not enough to sustain a conviction. That's double hearsay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Kim, I see we're getting up close to 6:35, so maybe we can finish up this slide. Is that
I was
work
going
for
to
you?
suggest that we finish the adjudication slides. I think there's still a few more, and then we'll save the rest for next meeting.
Well, there's one on appeals, and that'll be pretty quick, I think. So, okay, on exchanges between the officer and the defendant. In some trials, it may seem like a slight exaggeration for most, what people wanting, including sometimes the officer, really want to talk about the exchange after the stop. And sometimes people will make statements that they'll be on a video, an officer's body cam or whatever, that can be relevant, but in term, they, for example, have some concerns about the officer's attitude or something like that, and they want the judge to process their experience with them somehow. A lot of those exchanges aren't legally relevant, but on occasion where the courtroom isn't packed, I have been somewhat reluctant to, but willing to listen to them, just because both parties want the court to hear them. It's as simple as that. Intent and mental state, generally not relevant at violation trials. Immigration matters don't come up in municipal court. There's federal jurisdiction. There is an issue involving immigration holds in Oregon criminal cases. Emily, maybe you have an update on what's going on with that, because I know that's been in flux for some time now.
I am not up to date on any recent news on that.
Right. Okay. Final slide. And just the appeals process is pretty similar to appeals from any circuit court. The difference is that if you appeal to circuit court in Hillsborough, you have to do it within 30 days. It's a trial, it's a de novo trial, which basically means from scratch. It's as if the case hasn't been heard in a lower court, but there is an appeal fee. It's non-refundable, it's punitive in my opinion, because very few people want to spend $265 a filing fee to appeal a case. And actually there are circuit court fees that make it even more expensive. Is that right, Emily? So
it is. There's $100 and something trial fee on top of it. Works out to $420 to walk in the building.
Right. And then, the appeal fee is non-refundable. However, it can be waived. A lot of people don't seem to appreciate that, but it can be waived by the circuit court. Appeals beyond the circuit court are by the usual process through the Court of Appeals in the Oregon Supreme Court. Emily said that if Tigard becomes a court of record, then the appeal would go directly to the Court of Appeals and through that process rather than through circuit court, and that would be a little bit more efficient in terms of the process. Emily, do you want to add anything to that?
It feels to me like appeals out of our court are fairly rare.
Yeah.
I think I've heard 4 defendants in the last year say they were going to do it, and 1 did. Was that your experience as well?
Very rare indeed, yeah. And I think that fee has a lot to do with it. People would like another shot at it, but that fee is prohibitive. And in some cases,
I think so too.
strategically, I think there have been cases where attorneys will come in and actually bring stenographers and have the trial, the violation trial, recorded, knowing that they can appeal the result. But they're more interested in the civil case and compiling a record. It's a form of deposition for them to have have a municipal court trial. And it's a little bit more convenient for them. So, and I can understand that process as well. Unless there are questions.
What questions are folks left with?
Oh, I don't see any hands. Very comprehensive presentation.
A lot of material, but we're getting through it.
Hopefully, yes, hopefully we get to your questions next time, Valerie. I'm sorry to leave you hanging for another couple weeks. I know it's important to you, and I want to answer your questions. I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise.
Well, thank you, judges, very much for that excellent and thorough presentation. At this point in time, we have the opportunity to discuss any current events in Tigard and how they might be impacting the Tigard community. Is there anyone who would like to bring up current events going on in Tigard?
Nick, please.
Thank you. While it's not necessarily a current event, it will be an event for the next couple of years. I'm curious to the rest of the board how the 217 highway project has impacting people, their lives, and your neighbors. It's where I live off of 217. I talked to some people and they're just like, this is just horrible getting around. And I said, yeah, I think it's 2024 or something like that. So I just wanted to bring that up just as a talking point. I know there's nothing we as a board can do about it, but I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think the only other topic I know of is you were sent the invitation for the City of Tigard volunteer lunch. I believe it's on an upcoming Saturday, so RSVP if you can attend. Sean, please.
Well, Nick, I wanted you to get some feedback to your question. I have had to go around 217 one time. And first I just thought it was bad traffic. And then to my surprise, I could see a sign that said lane closed ahead. And I was just able to turn and go around that. And I will try to remember that for the next, how long is that project going to go? You're on mute. 3 years?
Yeah, he's saying about 3 years. I heard 2024.
So anyways, definitely some getting used to. I just wish we could get some relief on 99 and get 99 lanes or a throughway overpass or something, because 99 is so much busier than that road was ever designed to be. It's not safe. I think we all know that. The traffic cameras are just a start at trying to keep that highway safer. And I don't know. Eventually, I think enough people will get tickets in the mail they don't agree with, and that'll probably go another direction as it always seems to, and when those come about. But anyway, thanks, Nick. I'm rambling now, but I thought discussion would be good. And if we were all sitting around a table in person and not meeting virtually, I know we'd be having these conversations, and I think that's good team building. So thanks, Kim, for allowing us this time.
Thank you, Sean. Patty, I don't see any other hands. Oh, Jimmy.
Yes.
Just a second, let me lower my hand. Okay. As an update, my good friend and associate, Miss Valerie Sasaki, and I were able to participate in what I felt was a very wonderful conversation the other day regarding race in Oregon, 4 perspectives. Mine, Valerie's, and 2 other individuals that participated in this online training session. And out of that session, there were a couple of questions that came up, which I said I would bring forward to our group, because I'm not sure if we utilize any of these services in or around the Tigard area. There was a group, or is a group, entitled Portland United Against Hate, which is an activist-oriented group dealing with issues of hate speech, and working to engage community members in promoting safer environments for communities of color. Right2Be.org, which is a training organization, which also focuses on issues of anti-hate, anti-violence, and working on intervention strategies for folks who may see such things occurring in their communities and how to deal with that. We were able to work with, be part of a group with Rose High Bear, who is a Indigenous population community member and has been working with Indigenous communities for a number of years. And she also spoke on a group entitled wisdomoftheelders.org. They are an organization that focuses on climate change and connections with communities of color and Indigenous populations. And I said, well, I think those are all groups that we might want to just put into our records of note in case we get folks who may want to have some information at some point in time about how to be more planful and more focused on issues of social justice and equity.
Thank you, Jimmy, for sharing those great organizations. Valerie, please.
So very briefly, just to build on what Jimmy was saying, one of the organizations that was mentioned, or one of the initiatives that was mentioned that one of the organizers followed up with us today on, is a project through the Obama Foundation called My Brother's Keeper, which is it's an NGO funded project. It looks non-political, but it's aimed at improving outcomes for African-American men and boys. And one of the things that I just briefly looking at their website, communities can look into this and get tools that help them, connect with other similar communities on things that are going right, and get support for ways to improve outcomes for their communities of color. So I just wanted to mention that because I think the more resources that we can provide to the city folks, the better. It's not strictly within the policing mandate, but it certainly sounded like a very positive organization and positive initiative. So I'm happy to email that to you, Kim and Tammy, after the meeting, the link to that.
Please do. Thank you, Valerie. And Patty.
Well, I was going to say something similar to that. I would like for us to all possibly receive the links to all of these groups that you've just described to us. And I'm just wondering if that even feeds into future topics that we might be filling in towards the end of when we have that free time towards the end, whether we might actually have presentations and or build in some ways on some of these groups' work.
That is a great segue, I think, into talking about our upcoming meetings. So we are nearing the end of our time here. We have 5 more meetings after tonight. It does seem that judicial topics will probably take our whole next meeting, looking at the pace. So we may or may not have time for more topics together, but if we do, I'm definitely interested in what folks would like to talk about. We have officer appearance on the docket that's come up a couple times when we've had this conversation. However, there's other things. So far tonight, we've heard presentations perhaps from any NGOs working in the region, and neighborhood mediation / conflict resolution was something that Jimmy brought up earlier tonight as well. Interested to hear your thoughts of what you think would be most impactful to the community. Valerie, please.
So I believe that Washington County had a mediation program to resolve inter-neighbor disputes. I don't know if they still have that program. I know Beaverton has a program. And I would think that would be another, like youth court and peer court, another issue that, the judges would have to be willing to oversee or at least be involved with. And I think that they have a lot on their plate right now and budget constraints. So if there's a way to have resources at the county level, then I think that that's really useful. But I think it would be another ask of our already pretty stretched judicial folks, would be my thought on that. I know Jeff had in our prior meeting had discussed a topic that he might want to discuss as well. So I want to create space for that discussion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, did you have a topic in mind?
Yeah, it was around mental health response, more like street response, but I'm still working through the recommendation, hoping to get it done in the next couple weeks.
Oh, that's great. So we'll continue to hold that second meeting of May for the recommendation discussion. And if any other folks have recommendations that you're working on, do send them our way and we'll make sure that there's space for those. Even perhaps that first meeting in May, if we get a few. Okay, I think we are, we know our path forward through the end of June.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Is there anything else anyone wants to bring up before we finish up for this evening? All right. Do I hear a motion to adjourn at this time?
So moved.
Second?
A second.
Any objections or discussion or opposition? All right. I guess our meeting is adjourned.
Have a good night.
Have a
Good night,
good
everyone.
Good night, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.